Hello and welcome to another video. This one's going to be a bit different because I'm in the kitchen and I'm going to be baking cookies while I talk. Basically I wanted to do something a bit more lighthearted, and I asked on Twitter and everyone responded that they wanted me to make food and talk about ace representation in media. So I'm going to do both at the same time. Elliot did request that I make a souffle, but I don't have any ingredients for a souffle and it would take ages, so instead I'm just going to make cookies. I'm going to bake cookies. So yeah, if you enjoyed this video then do let me know in the comments below, because it could be something I end up doing more in the future. Only things better than cookies. Better things than cookies. So yeah, I'll get started and then talk, I guess, about ace rep. The thing about ace representation in media is that there isn't much of it, which is unfortunate for two reasons. One, it's kind of relegated to a specific genre. There isn't enough variety that it permeates all genres. Also, it means that it's harder for people to come across accidentally. Say me, for example, I tend to focus my watching of television and films on fantasy and sci-fi. That's what I prefer. I prefer fantastical things, because if I'm going to be watching something, I'd rather it be more exciting than real life. And trying to find ace representation within things that are more fantastical is difficult. Obviously, the representation we do have, a lot of it is really good. I've heard from a lot of people that BoJack Horseman representation is really good. But I haven't watched it. I haven't watched it yet. I will eventually get around to covering the representation at least. But BoJack Horseman is a show that really doesn't appeal to my tastes. But I do really want to see an ace rep of that caliber. And I don't know how long it will be until that would happen. And part of the problem is because people aren't willing to put ace representation in media, or queer representation in general. But also part of the problem is that asexuality as an orientation, I think, is more difficult to represent than other orientations might be. And that just comes down to the nature of what it means to be asexual and how it's presented. And what I mean by that is that, say if you want a gay character, you can introduce their boyfriend, or you can have them looking for a relationship. And it's fairly easy to include representation which is more subtle. Whereas with asexuality or aromanticism, you have to get into more depth about it just to bring it up in the first place. So you can't really... Well, it's very difficult to talk about asexuality without talking about sex. So it makes it difficult, say if you wanted to make a children's show, you couldn't really do a children's show of an asexual character per se. Aromantic you could. I think that would be a good place to have aromantic representation, is in a children's TV show. Not to say there's anything childish about it, but I think it's important to kind of introduce these ideas to children when they're younger, because then they'll get used to it. So going back to my point, I think it's difficult to have ace representation without talking about asexuality because of that. And I imagine there are ways around it. There are ways of doing it subtly. But the problem is you don't want to be too subtle, because if you're too subtle, then it doesn't seem canonical. And the author or whoever that created the medium has to specify outside of it that, okay, yeah, they are actually ace. which obviously isn't ideal. And I just realised I used too much egg. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. My point was that in, for example, fantasy and sci-fi, relationships don't take as much of a centre stage as, say, in a series like Sex Education, which is all about sex and relationships. So it makes sense to include asexuality within that conversation. Whereas I think you'd have to put a lot more effort into including asexual representation or aromantic representation in a show which wasn't specifically about those aspects of life. But it is possible. Semi-recently, within the last few years, Supergirl introduced a trans superhero, and I've had several storylines about her being trans, her being a trans superhero, and managed to incorporate or tell a story about transphobia, while still having like a superhero theme to it. And so it definitely is possible to do something like that. It's just the person who's making it needs to put that effort in. And I think because knowledge of asexuality and aromanticism isn't that widespread, it's difficult to garner that support. I suppose it's up to people who are like making short films to kind of broach that topic and prove that it is popular. Because I don't think we're anywhere near the point where you can, say, make a story like Love, Simon, which is mainstream, but it's also a gay coming out story. I'd like to be at that point. Hopefully we can be at that point at some point in the future, where it isn't as taboo to talk about lesser known LGBT plus orientations on TV or in films. But we're not there at the moment, is what I'm trying to say. What do I need to do next? I've been talking about TV primarily because that's where a lot of the representation has been, at least the representation that I've seen. But books, I think, are a medium which probably has had more overall representation. And I think that's because it's a lot easier for someone to write a book than it is to make a film. Because it's cheaper and it's something you can do alone, as opposed to a film where you need actors, you need kind of a studio or cameras, and I don't know, it's expensive things. I know how films are made, so yeah, I guess there's less of a risk in writing a book about asexuality, because there is that story that I read a few months ago, Upside Down. Which was pretty good. You can see my review for it on my channel. But I know recently Alice Oseman, I think her name is. Alice Oseman released a book called Loveless, which has an asexual protagonist, I believe. I will get to reading that at some point. I'm currently in the middle of a fantasy epic again. So I don't know how long that'll take me to read. I read quite slowly. Because I do so many hobbies that it's hard to get them all in sometimes. But yeah, that's one worth checking out. I will be at some point, and I will give you a recommendation if it's something worth recommending. I imagine it is. And I think she's a more well-known author than, say, some other people. It's not like she's this is her first book or something. I think she's a relatively well-known, which helps with representation, because yes, it's great for someone to write a book about asexuality if it's their first book, but I think it can reach a lot more people if they have an established audience. And especially if that audience isn't exclusively asexual and aromantic, because it's great having representation for people within the community, but I think it's equally as important, if not more so, to have representation for people outside the community, because it helps to normalise the orientations, and it helps to kind of educate people about this orientation. The question you've got to ask yourself when baking cookies is there enough chocolate? And if you are asking that question, the answer is always no. It's always no. There's no exception to that rule. There is never enough chocolate. So if you're doubting yourself, just add more chocolate. So I'm being kind of boring here. I'm just making plain chocolate chip cookies because that's pretty much all I have in. Simple, but nice. And that's what we like. So the cookies are in the oven. It's just going to take like 7 minutes. So I'll keep chatting until then. I just wanted to quickly mention that a few months ago I was a guest on the Sex Ed with DB podcast. The episode that I was in released last Wednesday, I believe. So if you haven't checked that out and you want to, then please do. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. But just before you do, a content warning that we do talk about sex and masturbation and orgasm, but we don't talk about it in specifics. But if that's something you want to avoid, then there's your warning. But yes, back to the topic at hand. I think the key to representation is to validate people who identify that way. So in this case, asexuals or aromantics, while also educating those who don't know about it. Those are the two goals of it, right? So you have to strike a balance between information to inform someone as like I guess, just as a jumping off point. It doesn't have to be like a full 101 of asexuality. It can just be an introduction, and then people, if they're curious, can find out more about it themselves. It's just kind of putting that little seed in their mind about maybe what asexuality means for someone. But it needs to be representative of a true asexual or aromantic experience. And not really fall on any stereotypes or common tropes about someone who identifies as asexual or aromantic. It's definitely a difficult balance to strike, and it's unfortunate that more people haven't taken that plunge and brought that representation to the forefront of media. But it is getting better, it has gotten better, so hopefully in the future there will be much more widespread orientation within different genres, within different mediums, and in different forms, because the asexual and aromantic communities are so broad, and so not everyone's going to be able to relate to someone like me, for example. I'm still like a white cis man. There we go. I'm a white cis man. I'm homo-romantic. Maybe even if you are asexual, there's a lot of parts of me that you might not be able to relate to. So it's important to have a lot of different representation, different like social backgrounds, different nationalities, because all these things do intersect with asexuality. And obviously, different parts of the A spectrum, different parts of the arrow spectrum, and different romantic orientations are important to represent as well, because you can't have a one size fits all representative for the asexual or aromantic communities. It's not going to work. They're way too broad. But yeah, that's pretty much the end of the video. I will show you the cookies in a minute. They should be done momentarily. If you enjoyed this type of video, then do let me know. I might do more in the future. I thought, since I'm cooking at the same time, I could make this a bit more rambly, just like a chat. So I think if I do videos like this in the future, it'll just be, okay, here's a broad topic, I'm just gonna start cooking and splurge my thoughts out into the internet. So it won't be as focused. I didn't make any notes. But yeah, I didn't think it went that badly, to be honest. So yeah, comments down below on your thoughts about this. Do you want me to do it in the future? If not, or if so, then tell me what thing to make next. it doesn't all have to be a sweet thing always, but to keep with the theme of the channel, I will be sticking mainly to dessert-based things, I suppose. And I won't do this too often because I don't want to ruin my teeth and gain a load of weight. But yeah. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like. I post videos every Saturday, so if you want to see more, then feel free to subscribe. That is all I had to say today. Have a wonderful day, and I shall see you next time. I should have thought better about using this. You can't really whisk. I want to use the whisk. I love using whisks, but it's not very convenient for this. Yes, I'm creaming things. Indie. Indie? Is that, you call them indie? I'm thinking about game development now.